Green Beret Major asked a single-dad cashier his rank as a joke. But when the quiet man wiped his hands, stood tall, and the truth about who he really was hit the room, the soldier who mocked him dropped to his knees in shame. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily above as Caleb Hart methodically scanned items at Register 3. His movements were precise and efficient, each product handled with care as he worked through the morning rush at Marshall's Grocery. The steady drum of rain against the store's front windows provided a soothing backdrop to the usual beeping of the scanner and rustle of paper bags. "Paper or plastic, ma'am?" Caleb asked softly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the elderly customer in front of him. His name tag gleamed under the bright store lights, perfectly straight on his pressed blue vest. Behind the register, 7-year-old Elijah sat, cross-legged on a small stool, completely absorbed in his toy helicopter. The boy's fingers traced the rotor blades with gentle dedication, his eyes focused on the detailed markings along its side. Every few minutes, he would look up at his father and smile, then return to his careful examination of the toy. "Such a well-behaved young man," the elderly customer commented, glancing at Elijah. "You don't see that much these days." Caleb's lips turned up slightly at the corners. "Thank you. He's my pride and joy." As he continued scanning items, his posture remained straight, shoulders squared, a habit so deeply ingrained it had become as natural as breathing. His movements were measured and deliberate, from the way he handled the groceries to how he counted back change. Everything about him spoke of discipline and precision. The morning wore on, marked by the steady stream of customers seeking shelter from the rain. Caleb maintained his quiet efficiency through it all, speaking only, when necessary, his responses unfailingly polite but brief. Occasionally, he would reach down to gently pat Elijah's shoulder or ruffle his hair, earning a bright smile from the boy. "Daddy," Elijah said suddenly, holding up his helicopter. "The main rotor system needs inspection." Caleb's eyes softened as he looked down at his son. "That's right, buddy. Safety first, just like we talked about." A few customers in line exchanged confused glances at the boy's unusually technical language, but Caleb simply continued his work, maintaining his careful rhythm of scanning and bagging. The automatic doors slid open with a whoosh, bringing in a gust of rain-cooled air and a tall man with military short gray hair. His bearing was rigid, his jaw set in a hard line as he grabbed a basket and filled it with a few items. There was something about the way he moved, purposeful but angry, as if the simple act of grocery shopping was beneath him. Caleb noticed the man's arrival, but kept his focus on his current customers, his movements never faltering. When the gray-haired man finally joined his line, Caleb could feel the weight of his scrutiny, but didn't acknowledge it. The man, Tom Grissom, though Caleb didn't know his name yet, placed his items on the belt: coffee, protein bars, and a bottle of aspirin. His eyes narrowed as he watched Caleb work, taking in the cashier's straight posture and precise movements. "$27.43, sir," Caleb said evenly, after scanning the last item. Instead of reaching for his wallet, Grissom leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying a sharp edge of sarcasm. "What's your rank, soldier?" The question hung in the air like the humidity outside. Caleb's hands stilled briefly over the register, but his expression remained neutral. Before he could respond, or choose not to, Elijah's clear voice cut through the tension. "My daddy was a Ranger colonel." The pride in the boy's voice was unmistakable as he looked up from his helicopter, beaming at Grissom. Caleb remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his son's declaration. His hands resumed their work, reaching for the receipt as it printed. His face betrayed nothing, but there was a subtle tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his shoulders. The rain continued its steady rhythm outside, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while inside the store, two military men, one bitter and searching, one quiet and hiding, stood separated by a grocery counter and years of untold stories. The tension hung thick in the air as Tom Grissom's sarcastic question lingered. Caleb's hands never faltered as they continued moving items across the scanner, the steady beep, beep, beep filling the uncomfortable silence. His face remained carefully neutral, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. In the next checkout lane, an elderly man in a worn Vietnam veteran's cap was placing his items on the belt, when Elijah's words about his father being a ranger colonel caught his attention. The man's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he studied Caleb's face. "Sweet Lord above," the elderly veteran whispered. "Caleb Hart?" His weathered hands trembled, and the paper coffee cup he was holding slipped from his grasp. Dark liquid splashed across the linoleum floor. "Colonel Hart from Kandahar?" The sound of the cup hitting the floor drew every eye in the immediate vicinity. The regular morning bustle of the store died down to a hush as people turned to watch the scene unfold. Caleb's shoulders tensed slightly, but his movements remained steady. "Sir, let me call someone to clean that up for you," he said quietly, reaching for the intercom button. "Don't you sir me, Colonel," the elderly man said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my grandson's unit. 3rd Battalion, 75th Regiment. That mess in Kandahar Valley." His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Tommy Williams, he was one of yours, Tom." Grissom's smirk faded as he watched the interaction. The elderly veteran's words carried weight, and the atmosphere in the store shifted palpably. Caleb kept his eyes down, focusing on scanning Tom's groceries. "The floor's slippery now, Mr. Johnson. Please be careful," he said softly, deliberately avoiding the mention of Kandahar. But Mr. Johnson wasn't about to let it go. "My Tommy told me what you did. How you went back in when everyone said it was suicide. Brought out 4 wounded men under heavy fire." His voice carried through the now silent store. "They said you disappeared after. Well, after everything. But it's you, isn't it?" A young store clerk hurried over with a mop, looking uncertainly between Mr. Johnson and Caleb as she began cleaning up the spilled coffee. More customers had stopped their shopping, drawn by the mounting tension and Mr. Johnson's words. Whispers rippled through the small crowd. "Ranger Colonel? Kandahar? Hero?" The words bounced from person to person like echoes in a canyon. Elijah, still standing behind the register, looked up at his father with worried eyes. He could sense the change in the air, the way his daddy's shoulders had gotten even straighter, if that was possible. His small hands clutched his toy helicopter tighter. Tom Grissom stood rooted to his spot, his earlier sarcasm forgotten as he studied the man before him with new eyes. The military bearing he'd initially mocked now took on a different meaning. He noticed things he'd missed before, the way Caleb's hands moved with practiced precision, the subtle scan of surroundings that came from years of situational awareness, the quiet authority in his stance even in a grocery store uniform. "Your total is $47.82, Caleb said to Tom, his voice steady and professional, as if the store hadn't just erupted into curious whispers around him. His fingers moved surely across the register keys, never betraying the slight tremor Tom thought he detected in them. "Mr. Johnson had moved closer, abandoning his groceries in the other line. "Colonel Hart, sir, I've been wanting to thank you for years. Tommy's got 3 kids now. A family that wouldn't exist if you hadn't—" "Please," Caleb interrupted softly but firmly. "It's just Caleb now." He handed Tom his receipt, still not meeting anyone's eyes. The whispers had grown louder. A teenager working at another register was frantically typing on his phone, probably searching for information about Colonel Hart in Kandahar. More people were gathering, drawn by the commotion. Elijah tugged gently at his father's sleeve, his face pinched with concern. "Did I say too much, Daddy?" he asked in a small voice that somehow carried through the murmuring crowd. Caleb finally looked away from the register then, his expression softening as he met his son's worried gaze. He placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "No, buddy, you didn't do anything wrong," he assured him, his voice warm and genuine for the first time since the conversation began. "It's okay." Without another word to anyone else, Caleb untied his work apron and hung it carefully on the hook behind the register. He took Elijah's hand in his, and together they walked toward the employee exit, their movements unhurried but purposeful. As they passed through the automatic doors into the rain, Tom watched them go, his groceries forgotten on the counter. Through the store's wide windows, he could see Caleb pull up the hood of Elijah's yellow raincoat, making sure his son was protected from the weather before they stepped fully into the downpour. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the man he'd so quickly judged. The quiet dignity of their exit stood in stark contrast to the growing buzz of excitement in the store. People were already pulling out phones, sharing stories they'd heard about Kandahar, speculating about why such a decorated officer would be working as a grocery clerk in small-town Tennessee. Tom stood there, his earlier cynicism replaced by something else entirely as he watched the former colonel and his son disappear into the gray curtain of rain. He'd walked into the store looking down on a simple cashier, only to find himself humbled by a man whose true measure he'd completely misjudged. Later that evening, rain drummed steadily against the windows of Caleb and Elijah's modest two-story home on Pine Street. The porch light cast a warm glow across their small front yard, where a worn basketball hoop stood sentinel beside the driveway. Inside, the house wrapped around them like a well-worn sweater, comfortable, familiar, and just a bit frayed around the edges. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, carefully coloring within the lines of his activity book, while Caleb prepared a simple dinner of mac and cheese, Elijah's favorite Thursday meal. The kitchen walls wore cheerful yellow paint and displayed artwork clearly made by small hands, each piece carefully framed as if it were a masterpiece. "Daddy," Elijah said without looking up from his coloring. The helicopter man looked sad today. Caleb paused his stirring, considering his son's words. Elijah had always possessed an uncanny ability to read people's emotions. "Sometimes people carry heavy things in their hearts, buddy. Like you do?" Elijah's innocent question hit home with painful accuracy. Caleb's hand tightened on the wooden spoon. "Yes, sometimes like me." After dinner, and Elijah's bedtime routine, teeth brushed, pajamas on, 2 stories read, and 1 glass of water, Caleb found himself drawn to the closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway. He rarely entered this room anymore, but tonight the memories pulled at him like an undertow. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the doorknob. The master bedroom remained frozen in time, exactly as Sarah had left it that morning 20 years ago. A layer of dust coated the dresser tops, but he couldn't bring himself to disturb it. Photos lined the walls, Sarah's bright smile, identical to their son Jamie's, beaming out from various moments in time. Their wedding day, Jamie's first steps, their last family vacation to the beach. Caleb's fingers traced the edge of a silver frame holding a photo of all 3 of them, taken just weeks before the accident. Sarah's golden hair caught the sunlight, and Jamie, age 6, showed off his missing front teeth with a proud grin. They'd been on their way to Jamie's soccer practice when the truck lost control on the wet road. The weight of survival pressed down on Caleb's chest. He should have been driving that day, not Sarah. He should have been there instead of halfway around the world, leading another mission. The familiar tide of guilt washed over him. Guilt for surviving when they didn't. Guilt for finding joy again with Elijah. Guilt for hiding from his past service when so many called him hero. A small voice broke through his thoughts. "Daddy?" Caleb turned to find Elijah, standing in the doorway in his rocket ship pajamas, clutching his stuffed penguin. The boy's presence acted like an anchor, pulling Caleb back to the present. "Hey, buddy. Can't sleep?" Elijah patted over and slipped his small hand into Caleb's larger one. "You looked sad again. Was she pretty?" Caleb followed his son's gaze to Sarah's photo. "Yes, she was very pretty and kind, just like you." "Can we make hot chocolate?" Elijah asked, tugging gently on his hand. "With extra marshmallows?" A small smile cracked through Caleb's melancholy. "Sure, buddy. Extra marshmallows it is." Across town at the Veterans of Foreign Wars bar, Tom Grissom nursed his second bourbon, the afternoon's encounter still needling at his mind. The bar had the worn-in feel of a place where old soldiers came to remember or forget. Dark wood paneling absorbed the low lighting, and faded military photos covered the walls. "Say that name again?" Old Pete, the bartender, leaned forward on his forearms. His weathered face showed keen interest. "Caleb Hart," Tom repeated. "Works down at Mason's Market. Quiet guy. Runs the register." A low whistle escaped Pete's lips. "Well, I'll be damned. So the stories are true. He did settle here." The few other patrons at the bar perked up at the name. An elderly man wearing a Korean War veteran cap spoke up from his corner stool. "Colonel Hart, the Angel of Kandahar?" Tom's eyebrows rose. "Angel of Kandahar? That's what they called him." The Korean War vet explained, his rheumy eyes growing distant with memory. "My grandson served under him. Said Hart had a sixth sense about danger. Saved his whole unit more times than they could count. Led from the front. Never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself." Pete grabbed a rag and began wiping down the already clean bar top, a nervous habit. "Heard he disappeared about 20 years back. Right after he got that silver star. Media was all over it for a while. War hero vanishes. Without explanation. Some said PTSD. Others figured he just couldn't take the spotlight." "Silver Star?" Tom's interest sharpened. He'd earned one himself in Afghanistan. An older woman at a nearby table spoke up. She wore a Navy veteran cap and handled her glass with arthritic fingers. "For the convoy incident. Saved 38 civilians and his entire unit when they got ambushed. Took 3 bullets pulling people to safety. But that wasn't why he left." Tom leaned forward. "Why did he leave?" The woman shook her head. "Not my story to tell. But whatever happened, it broke something in him. Man like that, decorated combat leader, doesn't just walk away for no reason." "And now he's bagging groceries," Tom muttered, more to himself than the others. The cynical part of him wanted to dismiss it all as small-town legend, but he'd seen something in Caleb's eyes today, a depth of experience that couldn't be faked. "He's not just bagging groceries," Pete corrected firmly. "He's raising that special needs boy of his. Does maintenance work for half the widows in town for free. Coaches Little League. Never talks about his service. Never asks for recognition. Just helps where he can." Tom swirled the bourbon in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. His own forced retirement, still burned, passed over for promotion, pushed out for being too aggressive, too outspoken. Yet here was a man who could have had it all, who'd earned real glory, choosing to live in obscurity. "Doesn't make sense," Tom muttered. Man like that could have written his own ticket, could have gone anywhere, done anything. The Korean War vet cleared his throat. Maybe he found what he was looking for right here. But Tom couldn't let it go. His reporter's instincts, honed through years of writing detailed mission reports, tingled with unanswered questions. What really made a decorated war hero vanish from the spotlight? What caused him to resurface in this small town, working a minimum wage job? And why did he seem so determined to keep his past buried? Morning sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting patches of light across Pine Hollow Elementary's special education wing. Caleb's old pickup truck pulled up to the curb, its familiar rumble echoing in the quiet morning air. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, clutching his backpack decorated with carefully placed helicopter stickers. "Remember what we practiced?" Caleb asked gently, turning to face his son. Elijah nodded, his face lighting up. "Deep breaths if things get too loud. Mrs. Wilson's room is my safe space." He recited the words with careful precision, each one practiced many times before. "That's right, buddy." Caleb reached over and straightened Elijah's collar. "And what else?" "You'll be here at 3 o'clock sharp." Elijah's smile widened. "Because Rangers are always on time." Caleb's eyes softened at his son's words. He helped Elijah out of the truck, watching as his boy walked, with determined steps toward the school entrance where Mrs. Wilson, his special education teacher, waited with her familiar warm smile. The grocery store was already bustling when Caleb arrived for his shift. Sarah, the teenage bagger who usually worked his line, was already arranging paper bags at his register. "Morning, Mr. Hart," she said, her usual cheerfulness tinged with a new note of respect. Word had clearly spread about yesterday's revelation. Caleb nodded politely, slipping on his name tag and beginning his morning routine. He checked his register with methodical precision, counting the till with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to mission preparations. The morning progressed steadily, a rhythm of beeping scanners and rustling bags. Caleb maintained his quiet efficiency, treating each customer with the same careful courtesy. The elderly woman counting pennies for her cat food. The harried mother with 3 small children. The businessman checking his watch, impatiently. Around mid-morning, Tom Grissom walked in, this time without his previous day's swagger. He didn't head straight for Caleb's line, instead wandering the aisles with a shopping basket that held only a few items. His presence didn't go unnoticed. Caleb saw him in his peripheral vision, but kept his focus on his work. Tom observed from a distance, watching as Caleb helped an elderly man with trembling hands pack his groceries, noting how other employees seemed to gravitate toward his register when they needed guidance or help with a problem. There was something in the way Caleb carried himself, a quiet authority that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. The morning shifted to afternoon, and Caleb's movements became more precise, his eyes checking the clock more frequently as 3 o'clock approached. He began preparing for his break, making sure the next cashier was ready to take over his register. Tom watched as Caleb walked to his truck at exactly 2:45 p.m., his prot, movements purposeful and unhurried. Following at a discreet distance in his own vehicle, Tom saw Caleb pull up to the elementary school right as the dismissal bell rang. Elijah burst through the school doors, waving a small, weathered American flag. The cloth was faded but clean, carefully maintained despite its age. The boy's face lit up at the sight of his father, and he ran full speed toward Caleb, who knelt down with open arms. "Daddy, look what Mrs. Wilson let me bring home!" Elijah waved the flag proudly. "She says it's just like the one you saved in the big sand place." Caleb gathered his son close, his usual stoic expression melting into genuine warmth. "It's a beautiful flag, buddy. Did you thank Mrs. Wilson?" Tom sat in his car, watching the scene unfold. Something about that small, worn flag in the boy's hands, combined with the pure joy on his face as he ran to his father, struck a chord deep within Tom's chest. It reminded him of his own children, now grown and distant, and how they used to run to him that way, back before the divorce, before everything got complicated. Making a decision, Tom got out of his car and walked toward them. This time, his approach was different. Slower, more respectful. He waited until Caleb had helped Elijah into the truck before speaking. "Colonel Hart," he said, his voice carrying none of yesterday's sarcasm. "I wonder if I could have a word?" Caleb turned, his face composed but guarded. Elijah watched curiously from inside the truck, still clutching his flag. "I owe you an apology for yesterday," Tom continued. "I was out of line. I'd like to buy you a coffee, if you're willing. There's a diner just down the street." Caleb studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I appreciate the offer, Major Grissom, but I need to get Elijah home. We have our afternoon routine." "Please, Daddy?" Elijah's voice drifted from the truck window. "Maybe Mr. Tom wants to be friends?" A flicker of emotion crossed Caleb's face at his son's words, but he shook his head gently. "Not today, buddy. Maybe another time, Major." His tone was kind but left no room for argument. Tom nodded, accepting the rejection with more grace than he might have shown yesterday. "I understand. Thank you for hearing me out." As Caleb climbed into the driver's seat, Elijah waved the small flag at Tom through the window. "Bye, Mr. Tom."
Daddy says everyone deserves a second chance.
Tom Grissom parked his car outside the weathered white church on Maple Street. The morning sun cast long shadows through its simple stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns on the worn wooden steps. He checked his watch, 9:15 a.m. Pastor Charles would be finishing his morning prayers about now. The door creaked as Tom entered. Pastor Charles Boone stood at the altar, his silver hair catching the light. He turned at the sound, his weathered face breaking into a gentle smile. "Good morning," the pastor said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of East Tennessee. "What brings you to our humble church so early?" Tom walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing. "I'm here about Caleb Hart." The pastor's smile remained, but his eyes grew cautious. "Ah, our quiet friend." He gestured to a front pew. "Please, sit." They settled into the wooden bench, and Tom noticed the fresh lumber used to repair parts of the ceiling. "I heard he helped rebuild after the fire." "That he did." Pastor Charles folded his hands in his lap, though he'd prefer I didn't talk about it. "The fire happened 5 years ago. Insurance barely covered half the damage. Then one day, materials started showing up." He tried to keep it anonymous, but in a small town like Pine Hollow, secrets don't stay buried long. The pastor's eyes drifted to a wheelchair ramp near the side entrance. "That's his work too, and the one at the library, and Mrs. Peterson's house after her stroke." Tom leaned forward. "He used his military pension?" "Most of it, I expect." Pastor Charles sighed. "I served as a medic in Vietnam. I know what it's like to carry weight that others can't see. Caleb, he carries more than most." Tom spent the next hour talking to others around town. At the hardware store, old Mr. Jenkins described how Caleb had quietly mentored his troubled grandson, teaching him carpentry and giving him purpose. The diner owner, Sarah, told him about anonymous payments that covered school lunches for struggling families. "He thinks we don't notice," Sarah said, refilling Tom's coffee cup. "But we do. We just respect his wish to stay in the background." At the local youth center, Tom met Bobby, a teenager with a prosthetic leg. "Mr. Hart taught me to swim," Bobby said, pride in his voice. "Never made me feel different. Just showed me how to work with what I got." Each story added layers to the mystery that was Caleb Hart. The more Tom learned, the more questions he had. By late afternoon, he found himself at the VA clinic, sitting across from Dr. Martinez, his counselor. The office was small but comfortable, with landscapes on the walls and a small desk fan humming in the corner. Dr. Martinez watched Tom with patient eyes as he paced. "I can't figure him out," Tom said, running a hand through his gray hair. "This guy's a decorated war hero. He could be living large on speaking circuits, writing books. Instead, he's scanning groceries and building wheelchair ramps." "Why does that bother you?" Dr. Martinez asked, her voice gentle but probing. Tom stopped pacing. "Because it doesn't make sense. A man with his record, his abilities. He's wasting his potential. Is he?" She adjusted her glasses. "Or is he using his abilities in ways you hadn't considered?" Tom sank into the chair across from her. "I keep thinking about his son, the way that kid looks at him, and how he just accepts everyone, helps everyone, but won't take credit for anything." "Maybe that's exactly what he needs to be doing," Dr. Martinez suggested. "Not everyone measures success the same way." "But his silence," Tom shook his head. "There's got to be more to the story." "Tom," Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "You've spent 3 days investigating this man like he's a mission objective. Maybe it's time to ask yourself why his story affects you so deeply." The question hit Tom like a physical blow. He stared at his hands, weathered from years of service. "I guess. I see how people respect him. Really respect him. Not because of his rank or his medals, but because of who he is now. And I'm sitting here, bitter about my discharge, angry at the world." Tom's voice grew quiet. "While he's just serving, without recognition, without reward." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. You came looking for a story about Colonel Caleb Hart, the war hero. But maybe what you need to understand is Caleb Hart, the man who found peace in the war hero, silence, and service. The words settled over Tom like a heavy blanket. He thought about the look in Caleb's eyes when Elijah had mentioned his past. Not shame or anger, just quiet acceptance. And maybe, just maybe, a trace of peace. Stop looking for the headline, Dr. Martinez said softly. Start looking for the man behind the silence. You might find answers to questions you didn't know you were asking. Tom sat there, letting the afternoon sun warm his face through the window, wrestling with thoughts of honor, service, and the quiet strength it takes to choose obscurity when you've tasted glory. The afternoon sun filtered through the grocery store's front windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floors. Tom Grissom walked through the sliding doors, his steps more measured than during his first visit. The usual bustle of shopping carts and conversation filled the air, but his attention focused on Register 3, where Caleb Hart stood scanning items with his characteristic precision. Elijah sat in his usual spot behind the counter, this time with a puzzle book in his lap. His face lit up when he spotted Tom.
Look, Daddy, it's the soldier man!
Caleb's shoulders tensed slightly, but his hands remained steady as he continued checking out an elderly woman's groceries. Tom waited patiently in line, watching the interaction. Caleb helped the woman bag her items, even carrying them to her cart, small gestures that spoke volumes about his character. When it was Tom's turn, he placed a single candy bar on the conveyor belt. Elijah giggled. That's not much groceries. You're right about that, buddy. Tom smiled at the boy, then turned to Caleb. Thought I'd try one more time about that coffee. Caleb's expression remained neutral as he scanned the candy bar. Sir, please, Tom interrupted, his voice softer than before. No, sir, just Tom. Elijah tugged at his father's sleeve. Can we have coffee with Tom, Daddy, please? His eyes sparkled with innocent enthusiasm. You said it's good to make new friends. Caleb looked down at his son, and something in his stance shifted. The rigid line of his shoulders softened just slightly. He checked his watch. My shift ends at 6. Perfect. Tom tried to keep the triumph out of his voice. There's a diner just down the street. Kelly's? I know it. Caleb handed Tom his receipt. Elijah has homework first. We can meet you there at 7. 7 it is. Tom nodded, noticing how Elijah beamed at both of them. The evening air had cooled considerably when Tom pulled into Kelly's parking lot at 6:55. The diner's neon sign buzzed quietly, casting a warm pink glow across the asphalt. Through the windows, he could see the usual dinner crowd, mostly locals he'd come to recognize during his investigation of Caleb's past. Caleb's truck arrived precisely at 7. He helped Elijah down from the passenger seat, the boy clutching his ever-present backpack. They found Tom at a corner booth, away from the busier sections. Hello again, soldier man. Elijah slid into the booth next to his father. Hi there, Elijah. Tom smiled, watching as Caleb carefully arranged the silverware in front of his son. The waitress, Sandra, according to her name tag, approached with a knowing smile. The usual chocolate milk for you, Elijah? Yes, please. Elijah bounced slightly in his seat. Black coffee, Caleb said quietly. Make that 2, Tom added. They sat in silence until Sandra returned with their drinks. Elijah immediately began drawing patterns in the condensation on his glass, while the adults studied their menus, though Tom suspected neither of them was really reading. Why did you come back to the store? Caleb finally asked, his voice low enough that only Tom could hear. Tom set his menu down. Honest answer? I'm trying to understand something that doesn't make sense to me. A decorated Ranger colonel working as a grocery clerk in a small town? Is that so? Strange? Caleb's expression remained carefully neutral. Many veterans work regular jobs, not ones with your record. Tom leaned forward slightly. I've been asking around. I know. Caleb's interruption was quiet, but firm. Small town. Elijah looked up from his drawing. "Daddy, can I have my puzzle book?" "Of course, buddy." Caleb reached into the backpack and handed Elijah his book and colored pencils. The boy happily immersed himself in his activity, creating a bubble of privacy for the adults' conversation. Sandra returned for their orders. A grilled cheese for Elijah. Simple hamburgers for the men. When she left, Tom tried again. "The people here respect you. They tell stories about what you've done for the community, but nobody seems to know why you left the service." Caleb took a slow sip of his coffee. The diner's overhead lights caught the gray at his temples, making him look older than his years. "I left by choice. After Kandahar, after I lost someone." Caleb's voice carried a weight that made Tom's throat tighten. Several someones, actually. The words hung in the air between them. Elijah hummed softly as he colored, oblivious to the tension. "I'm sorry," Tom said, and meant it. Caleb nodded once, then turned to help Elijah with a particularly challenging puzzle question. The subject change was deliberate and clear. That door was closing. They finished their meal with lighter conversation, mostly led by Elijah's enthusiastic descriptions of his day at school. Tom watched the interaction between father and son, noting how Caleb's entire demeanor softened around the boy. After paying the bill, which Caleb insisted on splitting, they walked to their vehicles. Elijah gave Tom an unexpected hug around the waist. "Good night, soldier man." "Good night, buddy." Tom patted the boy's shoulder, catching Caleb's unreadable expression. As they drove away, Tom stood in the parking lot, watching their taillights disappear around the corner. The evening had given him more questions than answers, but he'd seen something in Caleb's eyes when he mentioned his loss, a depth of pain that felt familiar. Meanwhile, in the modest house on Cedar Lane, Caleb tucked Elijah into bed with their usual routine: 2 stories, 1 song, and a prayer. The boy fell asleep, clutching his puzzle book, a peaceful smile on his face. Caleb walked quietly to his bedroom. The master bedroom remained mostly untouched, preserved like a museum to a life that ended too soon. He opened the bottom drawer of his dresser, pushing aside carefully folded clothes to reveal a wooden box. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age but unopened. His wife's handwriting flowed across the front. "For when you're ready, my love." Caleb traced the letters with his finger, as he had countless times before, then carefully returned the letter to its resting place. Not tonight, not yet. The morning sun crept through the curtains of Caleb Hart's modest home, painting golden stripes across his kitchen table. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten as he stared at the cream-colored envelope before him. His wife's familiar handwriting graced the front. "For Caleb, when you're ready." The edges were worn soft from years of handling, though the seal remained unbroken. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he traced his finger along the edge of the envelope. For 20 years he'd carried this letter with him, moving it from drawer to drawer, never quite finding the strength to read Sarah's final words. But something had shifted in him lately. Maybe it was Tom's persistent presence in their lives, or the way Elijah's love continued to heal old wounds. The house was quiet. Elijah was still asleep upstairs, his gentle snores barely audible through the ceiling. Caleb drew a deep breath, steeling himself. With careful movements, he broke the seal and pulled out 2 pages of flowing script. "My dearest Caleb," he read, his wife's voice echoing in his memory. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone. And knowing you, it's probably been quite some time since that day." A sad smile tugged at his lips. She had known him so well. "I need you to know something important. What happened wasn't your fault. Not the accident, not Jake's death, none of it. Life gives and takes as it pleases, and no amount of training or preparation can change that. You've always carried the weight of the world on your shoulders, my love. But it's time to set it down." Caleb's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. The morning light seemed to intensify, illuminating each word with crystal clarity. I know you're probably living like a ghost right now, going through the motions, keeping everyone at arm's length. That's not the life I want for you, Caleb. That's not the man I fell in love with. The man who could light up a room with his quiet strength, who made me feel safe just by being near, who loved our son with such fierce devotion. His hands shook harder as he turned to the second page. Coffee sloshed in his cup, creating tiny ripples that matched the tremors running through his body. Promise me you'll live again. Truly live. Not just exist. Find love again if it comes your way. Build a family if the opportunity presents itself. Jake would want that too. Remember how he always said his daddy was the bravest man he knew? He was right. A sob caught in Caleb's throat. He pressed his fist to his mouth, trying to maintain control as the emotions he'd held back for so long threatened to overwhelm him. The world still needs your heart, Caleb. That beautiful, generous heart that sees the best in people, that wants to protect and serve. Don't lock it away.
Someone out there needs your love just as much as Jake and I did.
The next paragraph was slightly smudged, as if tears had fallen on the paper as Sarah wrote it. I know you'll probably blame yourself for not being there when it happened, for being deployed when we needed you. But we were so proud of you, of your service, of the lives you saved. Jake used to tell everyone at school about his hero dad. We never felt abandoned. We felt protected, knowing you were out there making the world safer. Caleb's shoulders shook as he read on, each word simultaneously breaking and healing his heart. So here's what I want you to do, my love. Live. Really. Live. Help people. Like you've always done. Love. Again. Deeply. And without fear. And when you find someone who needs you, whether it's a child, a friend, or a new love, don't push them away. Your capacity for love was always your greatest strength. The final paragraph made his breath catch. I'll always love you. Caleb Hart, you gave me and Jake the most beautiful life we could have asked for. Now it's time for you to give yourself permission to be happy again. We'll be watching over you, cheering you on from wherever we are. All my love. Sarah. Caleb sat, motionless for a long time, letting the tears fall freely. The morning light had shifted, warming his face as if Sarah herself was reaching out to touch him. In the distance, he could hear Elijah beginning to stir upstairs. With gentle movements, he folded the letter and slipped it into a fresh envelope. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling lighter than the last. At Elijah's door, he paused, watching his adopted son sleep peacefully for a moment before entering the room. He placed the letter on Elijah's bedside table, next to the boy's favorite toy helicopter. As if sensing his presence, Elijah began to twitch in his sleep, his face contorting with the start of a nightmare, something that happened occasionally, especially after emotional days. No. Elijah whimpered, his hands clutching at his blanket. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. I'm here, buddy. I'm right here. Elijah's eyes fluttered open, wild with fear for a moment before focusing on Caleb's face. Daddy? Caleb gathered him close, feeling the rapid beat of his son's heart. I'm still here, he whispered, rocking slightly. I always will be. The Saturday morning dawned bright and clear as Tom's pickup truck pulled into Caleb's driveway. Inside the house, Caleb adjusted Elijah's jacket collar while studying his son's excited face. The boy couldn't stop bouncing on his toes, clutching his favorite toy helicopter. Remember what we talked about? Caleb asked gently, his hands steady on Elijah's shoulders. Listen to Captain Tom, Elijah recited carefully. Stay close. No running. A knock at the door made Elijah beam. Tom stood on the porch, wearing civilian clothes but still carrying himself with military bearing. His usual hard expression had softened somewhat. Ready for our mission, soldier? Tom asked Elijah with a gentle smile. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "Please, don't," he started, but stopped himself when he saw Elijah's delight. "The Military Heritage Museum has a special exhibit on rescue operations," Tom explained to Caleb. Thought the little man might enjoy seeing some real helicopters up close. Caleb hesitated, his hand still resting protectively on Elijah's shoulder. "He gets overwhelmed easily. If he needs to leave, we'll come straight home," Tom promised. "I've got his snacks, his comfort items, and your number on speed dial." Elijah tugged at his father's sleeve. "Please, Daddy?" "I'll be good." Caleb knelt down to eye level with his son. "You're always good, buddy." "That's not what I'm worried about." He studied Elijah's hopeful face for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, but call me if you need anything. Anything at all." The drive to the museum took 30 minutes. Tom glanced in his rearview mirror occasionally, watching Elijah in the back seat as the boy made his toy helicopter swoop and dive through imaginary missions. The museum wasn't crowded when they arrived. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor as they entered the main hall. Glass cases displayed uniforms, medals, and photographs. Model aircraft hung from the ceiling, their shadows dancing across the walls. Elijah stopped at every display, his face pressed close to the glass. He showed particular interest in a diorama of a mountain rescue operation. A small helicopter was suspended over a rocky outcropping where tiny painted soldiers worked to help injured comrades. "That's a HH-60 Pave Hawk," Elijah said clearly, pointing at the model helicopter. "For combat search and rescue." Tom blinked in surprise. "That's right. How did you know that?" "Daddy teaches me." Elijah held up his toy helicopter. "Mine's the same. 4 rotor blades, 2 engines. Daddy says it can fly in storms to save people." Tom watched as Elijah carefully compared his toy to the model, his small fingers tracing the air around the display case. The boy's knowledge wasn't just memorized facts. There was understanding in his words, passed down through patient teaching. They moved through the exhibit slowly, Elijah setting the pace. At each stop, he shared another detail learned from his father. The proper way to fold a flag, why medals have different colored ribbons, the meaning of the Ranger tab. Near the modern warfare section, Elijah grew quiet. A large photograph showed soldiers carrying wounded comrades through rough terrain. Tom noticed the boy's hands tighten around his toy helicopter. "Daddy helps people too," Elijah said softly, "but he doesn't like to talk about it." Tom knelt beside him. "Your daddy is a very brave man." "I know." Elijah nodded seriously. "He saves me from bad dreams. And he helps Mrs. Wilson with her garden, even when his leg hurts. And he teaches me to be brave, too." They stopped at the museum cafe for lunch. Elijah carefully ate his sandwich, the way Caleb had packed it, crust removed, cut into triangles. Tom watched the boy's methodical movements, seeing echoes of his father's precision. "You know what I think?" Tom said, keeping his voice gentle. "I think your daddy is still saving people, just in a different way now." Elijah considered this while sipping his juice box. "He saves everyone," he agreed simply. "That's why he's my hero." Elijah had dozed off during the drive, his toy helicopter cradled against his chest. He woke up as they stopped, immediately alert and happy. Caleb was waiting on the porch, tension visible in his shoulders until he saw Elijah's bright smile. The boy ran to his father, who scooped him up in a tight hug. "Captain Toy Soldier says you were brave," Elijah announced, using his nickname for Tom. A shadow crossed Caleb's face, but he managed a small smile. "Did you have fun at the museum?" "Uh-huh. I showed him all the things you taught me about the rescue helicopters, and the flags, and the medals." Elijah's words tumbled out excitedly. "Why don't you go wash up for dinner?" Caleb suggested gently. Elijah nodded and hurried inside, still chattering about his day. Once the boy was gone, Caleb turned to Tom with a warning in his eyes. Please don't fill his head with war stories and glory. That boy already knows who his hero is. Tom replied firmly, and the world needs to remember men like you, Caleb. Men who put others first, who lead by example. Caleb's expression hardened slightly. Some legacies are better left buried. Tom sat in his small home office, surrounded by stacks of military records and newspaper clippings. His laptop screen glowed with an old article about the Kandahar rescue mission. The more he dug, the more incredible Caleb's story became. His finger traced the grainy photo of a younger Caleb receiving a silver star. Time to make this right, he muttered, reaching for his phone. The first call went to retired Sergeant James Wilson in Kentucky. Hello, is this the James Wilson who served in Kandahar in 2003? Speaking, came the gruff reply. Sir, my name is Tom Grissom, retired major. I'm calling about Colonel Caleb Hart. There was a long pause. Colonel Hart? Haven't heard that name in years. Man saved my whole unit. Why are you asking? Tom leaned forward in his chair. I'm organizing something for Veterans Day. A recognition ceremony. The colonel's been living quietly in Tennessee, working as a cashier. A cashier? Wilson's voice cracked. That ain't right. Not for what he did for us. Over the next few hours, Tom made similar calls. Each conversation revealed another piece of Caleb's hidden legacy. A nurse in Florida who'd worked with him at a field hospital. A former lieutenant in Texas whose life Caleb had saved twice. A civilian contractor who remembered Caleb carrying children to safety during an evacuation. Tom created a spreadsheet, marking names, locations, and stories. His living room wall slowly transformed into a web of connections, each string leading forwarders back to quiet acts of heroism by Caleb Hart. At the VA office later that afternoon, Tom spread his research across his counselor's desk. Dr. Sarah Matthews studied the materials with a concerned expression. This is quite impressive, Tom, she said carefully. But have you considered that Colonel Hart might have his reasons for choosing anonymity? Tom paced the small office. You don't understand. This man's working minimum wage, living in a modest house, while guys half his worth are getting parades and recognition. Perhaps that's exactly what he wants, Doctor, Matthews suggested. Not everyone seeks the spotlight. It's not about the spotlight, Tom insisted, stopping to look at a photo of Caleb with his unit. It's about dignity, about showing his son what kind of man his father really is. Doctor, Matthews folded her hands. Tom, as someone who's worked with veterans for 20 years, I need to warn you. Public recognition can be triggering for some. It can bring back memories they've worked hard to process privately. But the town needs to know. His son needs to know. Tom's voice softened. You should see how he is with that boy. Everything he does is for Elijah, which might be exactly why he chose this life, Dr. Matthews countered. Sometimes the quietest path is the most healing. Tom gathered his papers, determination set in his jaw. I appreciate your concern, Doc, but I've seen something in that man, something that deserves to be honored. Meanwhile, across town in the Hart household, Caleb and Elijah sat cross-legged on their living room floor. An American flag lay carefully spread between them. Like this, Dad? Elijah asked, his small hands attempting to create a neat triangle fold. Almost, buddy. Caleb gently guided his son's hands. Remember, each fold has a meaning. This one represents life. Elijah's face scrunched in concentration. And the next one? The next one stands for belief in something bigger than ourselves. Caleb demonstrated the fold slowly. See how it makes a perfect triangle? Like your old uniform pins, Elijah beamed. Caleb paused briefly, memories flickering across his face. Then he smiled softly. That's right, son. Just like those. They continued folding together, Caleb's patient hands guiding Elijah's eager ones. The evening light streamed through their window, casting long shadows across the flag's stars and stripes. "Dad?" Elijah looked up. "Why do we fold it so careful?" Caleb smoothed the final fold. "Because it represents something important, something worth taking care of. Like you take care of me?" Caleb pulled his son close. "Exactly like that, buddy. Exactly like that." Tom, meanwhile, sat in his truck outside the VFW hall, making one final call. "Yes, sir, General Phillips." "I understand it's short notice, but given Colonel Hart's service record," he listened intently, then broke into a smile. "Thank you, sir. This will mean everything." He ended the call and looked at Adam, the collection of papers on his passenger seat, testimonials, medals records, combat citations, the makings of a ceremony that would finally bring a hero into the light. What Tom couldn't see was Caleb in his quiet living room, teaching his son about honor in his own way, finding peace in the simple act of folding a flag with the person who mattered most to him. The morning sun cast long shadows across Caleb's kitchen counter as he sorted through the day's mail. Bills, advertisements, and a plain manila envelope with no return address. His fingers hesitated over the unmarked package, years of military training making him wary of unexpected deliveries. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, happily munching on his cereal. "What's that, Daddy?" "Just mail, buddy." Caleb's voice remained steady, not wanting to worry his son. He carefully opened the envelope, keeping it angled away from Elijah's view. The moment he saw what was inside, his hands began to tremble. The photograph was grainy, but unmistakable. A military convoy engulfed in flames against an Afghan mountain backdrop. The same image that haunted his dreams for the past 20 years. His throat tightened as he recognized the specific vehicle, the one that had carried everything he'd ever loved. Below the photo, typed in stark black letters, "You can't hide from failure." The room seemed to tilt. Caleb gripped the counter's edge, his knuckles white. The cheerful sound of Elijah's spoon clinking against his bowl felt distant, as if coming from another world. "Daddy, are you okay?" Caleb forced himself to breathe, to smile, to fold the photo and note away as if they were nothing more than junk mail. "I'm fine, champ. Finish your breakfast. We don't want to be late." Throughout his shift at the store, the photo burned in his pocket like a hot coal. Every customer interaction felt mechanical, rehearsed. He scanned items, made change, and spoke the expected pleasantries, but his mind kept returning to those flames, to the moment everything changed. Mrs. Peterson, a regular customer who usually got a warm greeting, noticed the difference. "Are you feeling under the weather today, Caleb?" "Just tired, ma'am." The lie came easily, practiced over years of deflecting concern. By afternoon, his colleagues had picked up on his mood. Even Gary, the usually oblivious store manager, asked if he needed to go home early. Caleb declined, knowing that an empty house would only make things worse. The hours crawled by. When his shift finally ended, instead of heading home, Caleb found himself driving to the small white church on Pine Street. The evening light painted the steeple gold, and the worn wooden steps creaked familiar greetings under his feet. Pastor Charles was in his study, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed Sunday's sermon notes. He looked up at Caleb's knock, immediately setting aside his work at the sight of his friend's face. "Come in, son," the pastor said softly, gesturing to the worn leather chair across from his desk. The room smelled of old books and coffee, a comforting constant in Caleb's uncertain world. Caleb sat heavily, the photo weighing down his pocket and his heart. Someone knows Charles, about Afghanistan, about Sarah and Tommy. The pastor's eyes filled with understanding. He'd been one of the few people Caleb had confided in over the years, sharing fragments of his past during late-night conversations. What happened? Caleb pulled out the photo and note, placing them on the desk between them. Pastor Charles studied them without touching. His expression, grave. "The convoy was my responsibility," Caleb said, his voice hollow. "I cleared the route myself. I missed something. An IED. a spotter, something. And because I failed. He closed his eyes, the words catching in his throat. Sarah wanted to surprise me. She and Tommy were supposed to be at the base, but they hitched a ride with the supply convoy. They wanted to meet me at the forward operating base. The words came faster now, spilling out like water through a broken dam. I was 2 clicks away when it happened, close enough to see the explosion, close enough to hear. He stopped, unable to continue. Pastor Charles waited patiently, letting the silence hold the weight of Caleb's grief. I couldn't stay in after that, Caleb finally continued. Everyone called me a hero for the lives I'd saved, but I couldn't save my own family. How could I lead men when I'd failed so completely? So I walked away, disappeared, found this town and tried to build something simple, something quiet. The pastor leaned forward, his eyes kind but firm. You've carried this alone for too long, Caleb. It's my burden to carry. Is it? What about Elijah? What about all the people you've helped here in Pine Hollow? The lives you've touched? Caleb shook his head. I'm just a cashier now. That's all I deserve to be. You're more than your worst day, son. You're more than your deepest failure. Pastor Charles gestured to the cross hanging on the wall. Grace isn't something we earn. It's something we receive, even when, especially when, we feel we don't deserve it. But Caleb was already withdrawing, the walls building back up. He stood, carefully folding the photo and note back into his pocket. I should get home. Elijah will be wondering where I am. Caleb, Pastor Charles called as he reached the door. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Caleb paused, his hand on the doorknob. Thank you, Charles. But I do. He stepped out into the growing darkness, leaving the pastor watching his retreating form with worried eyes. The drive home was a blur. Inside his house, Elijah's babysitter reported that he was already asleep, worn out from a busy day at school. Caleb paid her, barely registering their conversation, and went to check on his son. Elijah lay peaceful in his race car bed, clutching his favorite stuffed helicopter. Looking at him, Caleb felt the familiar mix of love and fear. Love for this precious child who had brought light back into his life, and fear that he would fail him too, just as he had failed Sarah and Tommy. He gently closed Elijah's door and retreated to the kitchen, where the morning's mail still lay scattered on the counter. The anonymous envelope seemed to mock him, a reminder that no matter how far he ran, his past would always find him. The November morning dawned crisp and clear in Pine Hollow. American flags lined Main Street, their colors vivid against the backdrop of golden autumn leaves. Caleb adjusted his grocery store uniform, his movements precise as always, while Elijah bounced excitedly beside him. Food drive day, Daddy! Help the hungry soldiers! Elijah clutched his favorite toy helicopter, making soft whirring sounds. That's right, buddy. Caleb smiled, though something felt off about Tom's last-minute request for help at the VFW. Still, feeding veterans was a worthy cause, and he couldn't say no when Elijah's eyes lit up at the chance to help. They pulled into the VFW parking lot, unusually full for a Thursday morning. Elijah pointed at all the cars. Big food drive! Caleb's military instincts tingled. Too many vehicles. Too organized. His hand tightened on the steering wheel, but Elijah's innocent excitement made him push forward. The moment they opened the VFW doors, Caleb's world tilted on its axis. Instead of food boxes, he faced a sea of faces, familiar faces from town, weathered faces of local veterans, and faces he hadn't seen in 20 years. Faces from Afghanistan, from training grounds, from moments he'd locked away in the depths of his memory. Surprise! The crowd's voice filled the hall. Elijah squealed with delight, but Caleb felt his chest tighten. Tom stepped forward, wearing his dress uniform. Colonel Caleb Hart, sir. Your presence is requested at this long-overdue ceremony of honor. The walls were decorated with photos. Moments from Caleb's service career. Newspaper clippings of his achievements. Citations of valor. Someone had even hung his old unit flag. Each image felt like a knife twisting in his gut. "No," Caleb whispered. But Elijah had already darted into the crowd, showing his helicopter to a group of uniformed soldiers who greeted him warmly. Pastor Charles appeared at his side.
"Let them thank you, son. Just this once."
The ceremony began despite Caleb's obvious discomfort. Tom took the podium, his voice strong and clear. 20 years ago, Colonel Caleb Hart led one of the most successful rescue operations in Rangers history. 37 civilians saved, countless acts of valor. But that's not why we're here today.
Tears began flowing in the audience as Tom continued. "We're here because this man never stopped serving."
He serves quietly, humbly, every single day, building ramps for disabled veterans, helping troubled youth, working honest hours, and raising an extraordinary son. Elijah beamed from his seat in the front row, pride shining in his eyes. Caleb stood rigid, his face a mask of control, but his hands trembled slightly at his sides. A soldier Caleb had saved in Kandahar spoke next, describing how Caleb had carried him 3 miles to safety with a broken leg. Another told of Caleb's leadership during a sandstorm rescue. Each story landed like a physical blow to Caleb's chest, memories he'd tried so hard to bury resurging with brutal clarity. The mayor stepped up, holding a key to the city. "Colonel Hart, your hometown would be honored." The back doors burst open with a bang. Colonel Dalton Reed strode in, his uniform pristine, his face twisted with barely contained rage. The crowd parted instinctively before his aggressive advance. "Honor?" Reed's voice dripped with contempt.
"You want to honor the man who abandoned his post? Who left men to die?"
The room fell silent. Elijah clutched his helicopter tighter, looking frantically between his father and the angry man. Reed pulled out a folder, waving it like a weapon. Operation Shadowfall, May 15th, 2003. Colonel Hart abandoned his position, directly disobeying orders. 3 good men died because of his cowardice. The accusations hung in the air like poison gas. Caleb's face had gone pale, but his expression remained frozen, unreadable. "Daddy?" Elijah's small voice cut through the silence. "Are you okay?" Caleb finally moved, his shoulders squaring as if bearing an invisible weight. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed in the stunned silence.
"Daddy, wait."
Elijah tried to follow, but Tom caught him gently by the shoulders. "Where's Daddy going?" Tears welled in Elijah's eyes as his father's figure disappeared through the doors. "He said he'd always stay. He promised." The crowd stood in shocked silence as the door clicked shut behind their quiet hero, leaving behind a room full of questions and a frightened little boy clutching his toy. "Helicopter." Reed's satisfied smirk cut through the room like a blade. The celebration of honor had transformed into a public execution of reputation, leaving the VFW hall heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and a child's confused tears. Tom held Elijah close as the boy began to sob, his small hands still gripping the helicopter that symbolized everything he knew about his father, a father who had just walked away, leaving his son among strangers for the first time since his adoption. The sound of Caleb's truck starting up outside seemed to break the spell. People began whispering, some angry, others confused. The carefully planned ceremony of honor had crumbled into chaos, and at its center stood a weeping child who didn't understand why his hero had left him behind. The fluorescent lights of Pine Hollow Market buzzed quietly as Caleb stood in Manager Pete's tiny office. Outside the window, darkness had settled over the empty parking lot. His resignation letter, written in neat handwriting, lay on the cluttered desk between them. "You don't have to do this, Caleb," Pete said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Nobody here believes those accusations." Caleb's posture remained rigid, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. "It's better this way, sir." The "sir" slipped out automatically, a ghost of his military bearing that never quite left him. At home, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his untouched dinner growing cold. The toy helicopter that usually never left his hands lay abandoned on the counter. When Caleb approached, Elijah didn't look up. just pushed the peas around his plate in silent circles. "Time for bed, buddy," Caleb said softly. No response. Not even a nod. The next morning, Elijah's teacher, Miss Sarah, pulled Caleb aside during drop-off. Her gentle eyes held worry as she spoke in hushed tones. "He hasn't said a word all morning, Mr. Hart." When Jimmy tried to share his new toy plane, Elijah just turned away. She hesitated. "This isn't like him at all." Caleb's throat tightened. "He's just having a rough day." But it wasn't just one day. The silence stretched into the week. Elijah's bright good mornings disappeared. The evening ritual of helicopter sounds during bath time fell quiet. Even their special bedtime routine of naming 3 good things about the day became a one-sided conversation. Caleb watched helplessly as his son retreated further into himself. One evening, he found Elijah's homework untouched. The paper blank except for a single drawing. A stick figure in what looked like a uniform, standing alone in the rain. Meanwhile, across town at the VFW hall, Tom Grissom sat at the bar, nursing a glass of water and watching Colonel Reed hold court. The officer had lingered in town, seemingly enjoying the aftermath of his dramatic accusations. "Some men just can't handle the pressure," Reed was saying to a small group of younger veterans. Hart was one of those. A ghost soldier who needed to disappear. He laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. Tom's fingers tightened around his glass. He'd spent enough time around proud men to recognize when someone was performing rather than speaking truth. Reed's satisfaction felt wrong, too practiced, too pleased with itself. Later that night, Tom made some calls to old contacts still serving. His Green Beret credentials opened doors, and soon he was poring over service records in a borrowed office at the nearby Army base. The inconsistencies jumped out almost immediately. Dates that didn't match, reports filed retroactively, and most tellingly, signatures on crucial documents that showed subtle signs of manipulation. "Mission report from Kandahar, September 2003, Tom muttered, spreading papers across the desk. "Original after-action report missing, replaced with this." He held up a document that looked pristine, too pristine for a field report from a combat zone. Reed's name appeared frequently in the paperwork, surrounding Caleb's final mission, each mention feeling more suspicious than the last. Transfer orders, disciplinary recommendations, personnel reassignments, all bearing Reed's signature, all dated within days of each other. Tom's eyes narrowed as he discovered a pattern. Every document that might have supported Caleb's version of events had been either altered or conveniently lost. The paper trail painted a picture not of failure, but of careful erasure. In the break room, Tom overheard Reed on his phone, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "Of course I handled it," Reed was saying. "The ghost soldier won't be haunting anyone anymore. Should have done this years ago when he first tried to question my orders." A pause. No one's going to dig too deep. Who'd believe a grocery store clerk over a decorated colonel? Tom's jaw clenched. Reed's smug confidence confirmed what the records suggested. This wasn't about honor or duty. This was about power and pride, about silencing someone who knew too much. But the real cost of Reed's actions played out in a quiet house on the edge of town, where a father watched his son push away his dinner, withdrawal written in every silent moment. Caleb sat at the kitchen table long after Elijah had gone to bed, staring at his son's abandoned helicopter toy, its plastic blade still and silent in the dim light. The toy sat there like a symbol of everything that had been broken, not just Caleb's reputation, but the safe, stable world he'd built for his son. A world where heroes could be quiet, where service didn't need recognition, where a father and son could heal each other's wounds in peace. That peace was shattered now, and in its place lay something far worse than any public shame. The sight of his son disappearing into himself, retreating from a world that had suddenly become too painful to face. Tom's rental car bounced along the gravel road leading to St. Mary's Veterans Chapel. The small stone building sat nestled among towering pines, its weathered cross catching the late afternoon sunlight. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with determination. Staff Sergeant Maria Mendez stood waiting on the chapel steps, her chaplain's collar stark against her dark uniform. Her face was lined with years of service, but her eyes remained sharp and alert. As Tom approached, she didn't offer a handshake. Instead, she studied him with the careful assessment of someone who had seen too much war to trust easily. "Major Grissom," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority despite her lower rank. "You said this was about Colonel Hart." Tom nodded, following her inside the chapel. "I need to know what really happened." Colonel Reed showed up at a ceremony meant to honor Caleb. And Reed? Mendez's face darkened. That snake finally showed his fangs in public? They settled into a worn wooden pew. Mendez pulled out a worn leather briefcase, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. "I've carried these for 20 years, she said, removing a manila envelope, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. She spread several documents across the pew between them. Field reports, mission logs, and photographs. Spilled out. Tom picked up one photo. It showed a younger Caleb, surrounded by his unit, all of them smiling despite the desert grit on their faces. "That was taken 2 days before everything went wrong," Mendez said quietly. "Reed ordered us to attack a suspected insurgent position. But Colonel Hart, he knew something wasn't right. He'd spent months building relationships with the local leaders." Tom leaned forward. "What happened?" "Reed wanted a victory to put in his reports. Didn't care that our intelligence was shaky." Mendez's voice grew tight with old anger. "Colonel Hart refused the direct order. He said the risk to civilians was too high. Then he led a smaller team to investigate first." She paused, touching one of the documents. He was right. The insurgent position was a refugee camp. Women, children, elderly. Tom felt his throat constrict. Reed would have killed them all, yes. Mendez pulled out another paper, this one official-looking, with heavy letterhead. Reed was furious. He tried to court-martial the colonel for insubordination, but Hart took full responsibility. Said he'd resign quietly if Reed dropped the charges against the rest of us who backed his decision. "He sacrificed his career to protect his people," Tom said softly. Mendez nodded. "And those civilians?" Reed buried the truth, rewrote the reports. But I kept copies. Every document, every photo, every witness statement. I knew someday someone would need to know what really happened." She handed Tom a sealed envelope. "This is my sworn testimony about everything I witnessed. I've had it notarized and ready for years." Tom accepted it carefully, like it was made of glass. "Why didn't you come forward before?" "Reed had powerful friends. And Colonel Hart, he made us promise to let it go. Said the truth wasn't worth the careers and lives it might destroy." She smiled sadly. That was Caleb Hart, always protecting others, never himself. Tom gathered the documents, his mind already forming a plan. These will clear his name, show everyone what really happened. "It's not just about clearing his name," Mendez said, standing. "It's about showing that real courage isn't about following orders blindly. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." Tom drove straight to Caleb's house, but found only Elijah sitting on the porch steps, clutching his toy helicopter. The boy's face lit up when he saw Tom. "Captain Toy Soldier," Elijah called out, using his nickname for Tom. Tom sat down beside him, careful to leave space between them, as Caleb had taught him to do with Elijah. "Hey, buddy, where's your dad?" Inside, he sat again. Elijah's fingers traced the helicopter's rotor. "The mean man made everybody think Daddy was bad. But Daddy's not bad." "No, he's not," Tom said firmly. He turned to face Elijah directly, making sure the boy could see his eyes.
Your daddy never stopped being a hero. And now, I can prove it. Elijah tilted his head. Like in my stories, where the good guy wins? Exactly like that, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. Your daddy protected people who needed help. He chose to help others instead of helping himself. That's what real heroes do. The toy helicopter spun slowly in Elijah's hands. I knew it, he said simply. Daddy always says do the right thing, even when it's hard. Tom felt his chest tighten at the pure faith in the boy's voice. That's right, buddy. And now, everybody else is going to know it too. The Pine Hollow Community Center hummed with tension as residents packed the wooden folding chairs. Evening light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across concerned faces. Tom stood at the one, back, a thick manila folder tucked under his arm, watching as Mayor Thompson called the emergency town council meeting to order. Colonel Reed sat in the front row, ramrod straight in his pressed uniform, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd been holding court before the meeting, shaking hands, and accepting sympathetic nods from those who believed his story about Caleb's supposed failures. Tom stepped forward, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. Mr. Mayor, I'd like to address the council. Mayor Thompson adjusted his reading glasses. The floor recognizes Major Tom Grissom. Tom placed the folder on the podium, spreading out documents as he spoke. 3 days ago, Colonel Reed made serious accusations against Caleb Hart. Today, I have proof those accusations were lies. He lifted a document. This is the original mission report from Operation Silverback, signed by Staff Sergeant Maria Mendez, the unit's combat medic. Reed's smile vanished. He started to rise, but Tom's voice cut through the room like steel. Sit down, Colonel. You've done enough damage. The room fell silent. Tom continued, his voice steady. According to Sergeant Mendez's report, Colonel Reed ordered an assault on a village despite clear intelligence that civilians were present. Colonel Hart. Yes, that's right. Colonel Caleb Hart countermanded that order to protect innocent lives. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tom held up another document. This is the citation for Caleb's Silver Star, awarded for the very mission Reed claims he botched. Caleb found a way to complete the objective without civilian casualties. He didn't fail. He succeeded by putting humanity before blind obedience. Pastor Charles stood up from his seat. But why did he leave the service? Tom's expression softened. Because Reed buried the truth. He threatened to court-martial the entire unit if Caleb didn't take early retirement and stay quiet. Caleb sacrificed his career to protect his SID. Soldiers. That's preposterous, Reed exploded, face reddening. Those documents are forgeries. Are they? Tom nodded to the back of the room. A woman in an Army chaplain's uniform stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, Staff Sergeant Maria Mendez. The former combat medic walked to the podium, her bearing professional, but her eyes blazing. Everything Major Grissom said is true. I was there. Colonel Hart saved not only civilian lives, but our entire unit. Colonel Reed ordered us to attack a village where children were playing. Colonel Hart found another way. Reed jumped to his feet. This is slander! I'll have you court-martialed! No, you won't. Tom pulled out one final document. This is a signed statement from General Marshall confirming a full investigation into your conduct. Your retirement papers are being processed as we speak. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Mayor Thompson banged his gavel for order. Colonel Reed, I suggest you leave. Now, Reed's face turned purple. He grabbed his cap and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Tom faced the crowd. Caleb Hart never stopped being a hero. He just chose to serve quietly, here in Pine Hollow, asking nothing in return. He's been teaching us all along about what real strength looks like. Pastor Charles stood again. Where is Caleb now? At home with Elijah, Tom replied. He didn't want to be here for this. That's who he is. More concerned about his son's well-being than his own reputation. The mayor cleared his throat. "I believe we owe Colonel Hart an apology. And our gratitude." Heads nodded throughout the room. Someone started clapping. And soon, the whole room joined in. Tom gathered his documents, knowing Caleb wouldn't want this attention, but needed it. Needed to know the truth was finally out. Later that evening, Tom stopped by the community center's bulletin board to post a notice about the council's resolution clearing Caleb's name. Elijah was there, studying a colorful flyer with intense concentration. "What have you got there, buddy?" Tom asked. Elijah's fingers traced the words on the paper. It was an old flyer, slightly faded, advertising a veteran-led mentorship program for special needs children. At the bottom was a note in Caleb's handwriting, "Maybe someday." Elijah looked up at Tom with those clear, knowing eyes that always seemed to see straight to the heart of things. "Can Daddy teach other kids like me?" Tom stared at the flyer, remembering conversations with Caleb about his dreams of helping other children, of using his experience to make a difference. He thought about all the times he'd seen Caleb working with Elijah, teaching him with endless patience and understanding. Early morning sunlight filtered through the grocery store windows, casting long shadows across empty aisles. The automatic doors whispered open as Caleb Hart made his way inside, his shoulders slightly hunched, his movements mechanical as he pulled on his familiar blue work vest. The store hadn't opened yet, and the quiet felt heavy with memories. He paused at register 3, his usual spot, and ran his fingers along the smooth counter. A week had passed since his resignation, but Mr. Peterson, the store owner, had refused to accept it. "Take time to think," he'd said, holding the letter unopened. The bell above the entrance chimed. Caleb didn't need to look up to know who it was. He recognized the purposeful footsteps, the slight shuffle of military boots on linoleum. "Store's not open yet," Caleb said quietly, still not looking up. "I'm not here to shop." Tom's voice was different, softer, stripped of its usual edge. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in blue velvet. Caleb finally raised his eyes, noting the change in Tom's demeanor. Gone was the cynical retired major. Instead, he saw a man humbled, his usual confident stance replaced by something more uncertain. "I owe you an apology," Tom said, taking slow steps forward. "Several, actually." Caleb shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Tom's voice cracked slightly. He stopped at the register and, to Caleb's surprise, lowered himself to one knee. The gesture, a warrior's sign of deepest respect, made Caleb step back. "Please don't, let me finish," Tom insisted, holding up a hand. His eyes shone with emotion. "That first day, I mocked you. Saw a man in a grocery store vest and thought I knew his measure. I was wrong. So wrong." Caleb swallowed hard, his hands gripping the counter edge. "Tom, please stand up." But Tom stayed where he was, carefully unwrapping the velvet bundle. Inside lay Caleb's restored commendation, its gold lettering catching the morning light. I didn't see the man behind the silence. I didn't understand that true strength isn't about medals or rank or recognition. It's about choosing to serve day after day, even when no one's watching. The commendation seemed to glow between them. Caleb stared at it, memories flooding, back faces of men he'd led, lives he'd tried to save, decisions that had haunted his dreams. "You chose to protect your men," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. "You chose to shield civilians. You chose to bear the weight of silence rather than compromise your principles. And then you chose to keep serving not in uniform, but in countless small ways that made this town better." Caleb's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure. "I just did what needed doing." "Exactly." Tom's voice was gentle now. "That's what makes you the hero you never wanted to be." The morning light had grown stronger, warming the store's interior. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear cars pulling into the parking lot, the town coming to life. "Your son sees it," Tom said softly. Elijah knows exactly who you are. Maybe it's time you let the rest of us see it too. Caleb's hands trembled as he reached for the commendation. The metal felt cool against his fingers, familiar yet strange. He thought of his late wife's letter, of her plea to keep living and loving. He thought of Elijah's proud face whenever he spoke about his daddy. The store's front door chimed again. They both looked up to see Elijah bouncing in, followed by Pastor Charles and several town council members. Behind them came more people, veterans Caleb had helped quietly over the years. Families whose homes he'd repaired, children he'd mentored. "What's all this?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom finally stood, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "This is your family, Colonel Hart, the one you built without even trying." Elijah rushed forward, wrapping his arms around his father's waist. "Did you say yes yet, Daddy?" "Say yes to what, buddy?" "To being our hero," Elijah said simply, looking up with those clear, honest eyes that always saw straight to the truth. Caleb looked around at the gathering crowd, at all the faces that had become part of his quiet life. He saw no judgment in their eyes, only respect, and something deeper, acceptance, understanding. His fingers tightened around the commendation as tears finally spilled onto his cheeks. "I accept," he said hoarsely. "Not for me, but for the men we lost, for the ones who never came home." He paused, looking down at Elijah. "And for the ones still finding their way." The crowd burst into applause, the sound echoing off the store's high ceiling. Above it all, Elijah's voice rang out clear and proud. "That's my daddy." The church basement had been transformed. Gone were the dusty folding chairs and tired card tables. Instead, bright posters decorated the walls, some showing military aircraft, others displaying cheerful welcome messages in rainbow colors. 5 round tables dotted the room, each set up with art supplies, small American flags, and name tags waiting to be filled out. Caleb stood at the bottom of the stairs, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as Tom arranged the last of the craft supplies. The familiar scent of coffee wafted from a corner table where Pastor Charles had set up refreshments for the parents and veterans. "You sure about this?" Then Caleb asked, his voice quiet but steady. Tom looked up from arranging colored pencils. "For the 10th time, yes. These kids need you. Need us." Elijah bounced on his toes beside his father, clutching his beloved toy helicopter. "Can I show them how to fold flags like you taught me, Daddy?" Caleb's expression softened as he ruffled his son's hair. "Of course, buddy. You're going to be a great helper today." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them all turn. A young mother guided her daughter down, the girl's hand trailing carefully along the railing. Behind them came 2 more families, then 3 veterans Caleb recognized from the VFW. Within minutes, the basement hummed with nervous energy as children explored the space, and parents exchanged tentative smiles. "Welcome to Operation Honor," Tom announced, his voice carrying the same authority it had in the field, but gentler now. "I'm Tom Grissom, and this is Colonel Caleb Hart. We're here because every child deserves to know they're special, and every veteran has something valuable to share." Caleb stepped forward, conscious of the eyes on him. "There's no pressure here," he said softly. "Just friendship and understanding. Like my son Elijah taught me, sometimes the biggest victories come in small moments." The children began gravitating toward different tables, some shy, others eager. A boy with Down syndrome immediately went to Elijah's table, drawn by the toy helicopter. A girl in a wheelchair positioned herself near Tom, who pulled up a chair to sit at her eye level. Caleb found himself with 2 children, a boy who wouldn't make eye contact, and a girl who couldn't stop moving. He recognized the patterns, having seen similar behaviors in Elijah. With gentle patience, he showed them how to hold the corners of a flag. "The blue always goes here," he explained, demonstrating the first fold. "Because blue means honor, and honor leads the way." The girl's constant movement slowed as she concentrated on matching his actions.
The boy, though still looking down, reached out to touch the fabric with careful fingers. Around the room, other veterans were finding their rhythm. Staff Sergeant Martinez helped a group string red, white, and blue beads into bracelets. Captain Williams, who'd lost a leg in combat, showed fascinated children how his prosthetic worked. "Look, Daddy," Elijah called out. He was helping his new friend fold paper into simple airplane shapes, the same way Caleb had taught him on quiet evenings at home. Parents who had arrived tense and uncertain began to relax, some wiping away tears as they watched their children bloom under the patient attention. The veterans, too, seemed to stand taller, their own burdens lighter, as they shared their stories and skills. Tom moved between groups, his earlier cynicism replaced by genuine joy. He caught Caleb's eye across the room and nodded, both men understanding without words how much this meant. Pastor Charles brought coffee to the parents' corner, where they had started sharing their own stories. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, smiling at Caleb. "Sometimes it takes a broken heart to know how to heal others." As the morning progressed, the basement filled with laughter and achievement. Children proudly displayed their folded flags and craft projects. Veterans who had arrived uncertain of their place now sat surrounded by eager listeners as they told age-appropriate stories of courage and friendship. Near the end of the session, a small commotion drew everyone's attention. A little boy had become overwhelmed, crying in a corner. Before any adult could react, Elijah walked over and sat down beside him. "It's okay," Elijah said, his voice clear and kind. "Sometimes things are too much for me too. Want to hold my helicopter? It helps me feel better." The crying child looked up, surprised by the offer. Slowly, he reached for the toy, and Elijah showed him how the rotor spun. Within moments, the tears stopped, replaced by curious questions about the helicopter's parts. Caleb watched the scene unfold, his throat tight with emotion. Tom stood beside him, both men witnessing the simple act of compassion. "That's his mother's heart," Caleb whispered to Tom, his voice thick with pride and memory. "She'd be proud." The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Hollow's town square as people gathered for the annual Veterans Day ceremony. The crowd was larger than usual this year, with familiar faces from the community mixed with visitors who had traveled from neighboring towns. Wooden chairs lined the grass in neat rows, reminiscent of military precision. Caleb Hart stood behind the podium, his posture straight but relaxed. The past year had softened the hard edges that once defined him. His uniform, worn for the first time since leaving service, fit differently now, not because of physical changes, but because the man wearing it had transformed. In the front row, Elijah sat between Tom and Pastor Charles, practically vibrating with excitement. He wore a miniature ranger pin on his collar, a gift from one of the veterans in their mentorship program. The boy's eyes never left his father's face. "A year ago," Caleb began, his voice steady and clear, "I stood in this square, believing my service was something to hide. I thought being strong meant being silent." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the gathered faces. "I was wrong." A gentle breeze rustled the flags that lined the square. Tom nodded encouragingly, remembering the long conversations that had led to this moment. "True strength," Caleb continued, "isn't found in medals or commendations. It's found in the quiet moments. When we choose to serve others, it's in the smile of a child who finally believes in themselves. It's in the veteran who finds purpose again through mentoring." From his seat, Elijah beamed. He knew these words weren't just about war stories. They were about Tuesday afternoons in the church basement, where veterans and children built model airplanes together, where healing happened without fanfare. Operation Honor started with one simple truth, Caleb said, his voice warming with emotion. "We all need someone to believe in us. Sometimes that someone is a fellow veteran who understands our struggles. Sometimes it's a child who sees past our scars to the heart beneath." In the audience, several parents wiped away tears. Their children, once isolated by their special needs, had found belonging in the program Caleb and Tom had built. Weekly sessions had grown from 5 children to 25, with a waiting list that spoke volumes about the community's need. Humility isn't about hiding your light, Caleb shared, touching the Ranger tab on his shoulder. It's about using whatever gifts you have to lift others up. Grace isn't earned, it's given freely, often through the simple act of showing up for someone else. Tom watched his friend with pride, remembering the bitter man he'd been when he first arrived in Pine Hollow. His own healing had come through watching Caleb's journey, through participating in something bigger than his own pain. Love, Caleb said, his voice softening as he looked at Elijah, is the greatest service of all. It's what transforms duty into purpose. It's what turns strangers into family. The morning light strengthened, warming the square. Veterans in the audience sat straighter, many wearing Operation Honor pins alongside their service medals. They had found new purpose in mentoring, in sharing their experiences with children who saw them as heroes. As Caleb concluded his speech, Elijah could hardly contain himself. He bounced in his seat, watching his father step down from the podium to sustained applause. The crowd rose to their feet, not just out of respect for a decorated ranger, but for a man who had shown them how to serve with love. The ceremony continued with other speakers, but the heart of the message had already been delivered. Throughout the day, people approached Caleb to share stories of how Operation Honor had touched their lives. A mother spoke of her daughter's newfound confidence. A veteran described finding peace in teaching woodworking to eager young students. As evening approached, Caleb and Elijah headed home. Their modest house looked different now lived in, loved, filled with new memories alongside the old ones. The master bedroom, once a shrine to grief, had become a place of healing. Photos of Caleb's late wife and son still held places of honor, but they were now surrounded by pictures of Elijah's artwork and snapshots from Operation Honor events. Elijah carried a carefully folded flag as they climbed the porch steps. It was a new flag, bright and crisp, waiting to replace the weathered one that had flown through 4 seasons of change. Together they lowered the old flag with reverence. "Remember what I taught you about respect?" Caleb asked softly. "Yes, sir," Elijah replied, his movements deliberate as he helped attach the new flag to the line. They raised it together, father and son, their hands working in unison until it caught the evening breeze. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting a warm glow over their porch. Elijah stepped back, raised his hand in a perfect salute just as Tom had taught him, and turned to his father with eyes full of pride and understanding beyond his years. "Daddy saves people every day," he said simply. Caleb felt tears well up in his eyes, but these weren't tears of pain or regret. They were tears of gratitude, of joy, of finally understanding that home wasn't the house behind them or even the town around them. Home was this moment, this purpose, this peace he'd found in being exactly who he was meant to be. Home was in Elijah's unwavering faith in him, in the way his son's love had taught him to love himself again. Home was in the simple truth that serving others had healed wounds he thought would never close. As the flag waved gently above them, Caleb drew Elijah into a tight embrace, knowing that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not on battlefields, but in choosing to open your heart again, in learning to trust, in daring to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. The evening settled around them, peaceful and complete, as father and son stood together on their porch, watching their flag catch the last rays of sunlight. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Caleb Hart, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.